May 14, 1944. Dawn broke over northern France with a silence that felt borrowed. A fragile calm draped across the sky like thin gauze over a wound that refused to heal, and from the high canopy of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, two men watched the world unfold beneath them, unaware that before the hour was out they would witness something that would change how they looked at the sky forever. Oberleutnant Ernst Keller adjusted his oxygen mask and leaned forward over the instruments, his gloved hands steady but his pulse rising, his eyes drawn to the horizon where the morning haze shimmered like metal, and below the ghostly landscape of France, rivers snaking like veins, fields scarred with craters, the remains of farmhouses burned to black geometry, seemed to whisper reminders of what this war had cost. The crew's orders were clear: photograph Allied transport routes, confirm rail damage from the last night's bombing, and return before the Spitfires rose to hunt, because everyone in the Luftwaffe knew by 1944 that to linger in Allied airspace was to court death. Itself, for the British pilots, had grown bolder, faster, deadlier. Their Spitfires no longer just symbols of defiance but instruments of vengeance, sharpened by years of survival. At first, the flight seemed routine, the hum of the engines merging with the thin whine of the wind. Keller's observer, Unteroffizier Franz Reiter, scribbling coordinates, checking the camera film, his pencil trembling slightly in the cabin's vibration. And then Reiter froze, hand halfway to his map, eyes fixed on something in the distance, something moving fast and erratic, far beyond their flight path. Keller followed his gaze, squinting into the glare, and what he saw sent a ripple through his chest. A half-dozen aircraft locked in violent motion, circling, diving, bursting apart through the clouds like sparks from a forge, and though it was too far to hear, he could feel the battle, the fury of men locked in the oldest contest of flight. Kill or be killed, mastery or oblivion. The silhouettes were hard to make out through the haze, but one shape was unmistakable: the graceful elliptical. Wings that could belong to only one machine, the Supermarine Spitfire. Keller had fought them before, in the early years when the Luftwaffe still claimed the skies over Britain, when confidence came as easily as breath, but this was different. These Spitfires moved with purpose, not desperation, their attacks coordinated with eerie precision, each climb and roll executed as if guided by an unseen rhythm, and Keller realized with a tightening in his gut that these were not rookies or panicked defenders, these were predators. Reiter grabbed his binoculars and muttered, "Mein Gott, they're playing with them," and Keller said nothing, only nodded as he watched one Spitfire break formation, dive through a cloud bank and reappear behind a German Focke-Wulf that hadn't even seen it coming. A burst of tracer fire slicing through the thin air, the German plane bursting into flame and rolling into a spiral of smoke that streaked downward until it vanished into the countryside below. The Spitfire didn't even linger. It banked, looped, and returned to its formation, ready for the next kill. In that instant, the sky no longer belonged to the Reich, and Keller knew it. He whispered to himself, "Der Himmel ist verloren." The sky is lost, and Reiter, hearing him, shuddered as if the words themselves had weight. What unnerved them most was not the violence, but the control. The British pilots flew as if fear itself had been burned out of them, as if after years of defending their island they had become something more than men and machines. The Germans had once prided themselves on their training, their discipline, their precision. But watching the Spitfires that morning, Keller saw what discipline looked like when fused with desperation, when every pilot knew he was not fighting for conquest but for survival. The Luftwaffe had become the hunted, and deep down both men understood it. The dogfight ended as quickly as it began. One last flare of gunfire, a final plume of smoke curling toward the ground, and then silence. Only the whisper of wind over metal, the hum of their own engines filling the void. Reiter exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath, and began to jot something on his report sheet. But his hand stopped halfway, trembling again, and Keller reached out to steady it, saying softly, "Write it down. They'll want to know," though he knew the truth. No one in command would understand what they had just witnessed, because this wasn't data or reconnaissance. It was a warning, a glimpse of the new order of the skies. Keller turned their plane toward base, but even as they climbed, he could not stop glancing over his shoulder, scanning the clouds, half expecting a shape to emerge. A Spitfire ghosting through the mist, silent, watching, reminding them that nowhere was safe anymore below, the fields blurred by, rivers flashing like mirrors. And Keller thought of the young pilots training back home, boys being told they were the future of the Luftwaffe, and he wondered if they would ever see that future, because in that brief moment above France it felt as though the future had already been written, carved into the air by those British fighters who had turned survival into art. When they landed hours later, the base officer asked for the usual report, coordinates, damage assessments, Allied strength, but Keller said little, only handed over the logbook and stared out across the runway, where smoke from the morning's bombing still hung low over the fields. Reiter, unable to shake the image of that Spitfire banking through the light, said quietly, "They own the air now, don't they?" And Keller, after a long pause, replied, "They own something more than that. They own fear, because that was what had changed. Not the machines, not the tactics, but the hearts of the men who flew them. By 1944, every German pilot knew what it meant to face a Spitfire. But few had ever watched them like this, from above, from the outside, realizing that power was slipping away one dogfight at a time, and somewhere deep inside, Keller understood that the war was already lost, not in factories or maps, but here, in this vast silence after the storm, where the victors wrote their message across the clouds and contrails and smoke. The next day his report would be buried among dozens of others, the details reduced to numbers and notes, but the truth of what he saw that morning would live on among pilots long after the Reich itself had fallen. The story would pass from crew to crew, how on May 14th, a German reconnaissance flight witnessed the moment the air itself turned against them, and how the Spitfires, once outnumbered and outmatched, had risen from the ashes of defeat to rule the skies without mercy. And even years later, when the war was over and the skies were quiet again, Keller would remember that morning whenever he looked up at the clouds, remembering the shapes that moved within them, the hunters who had once danced with death and come out smiling, and he would wonder whether courage was something a man could ever truly understand until he had seen it from above, helpless to intervene, watching history unfold in contrails and fire. Would you have seen it coming? By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe was no longer a frontier of glory, but a graveyard of ambition, filled with the ghosts of men who had believed that speed and skill could outfly fate, and though the Luftwaffe still wore its black cross with pride, those who flew beneath it knew in their hearts that the balance of power had shifted, that the same skies that once echoed with the confident hum of German engines now trembled beneath the roar of Allied air fleets that stretched from horizon to horizon. The air war had begun as a contest of nerve and innovation, but by 1944 it had become a machine, a relentless cycle of destruction and replacement, where each pilot was a part of something vast, mechanical, and unforgiving, and no one felt this more than the men of the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance units, who saw everything but could change nothing. Oberleutnant Ernst Keller was one of them, a man forged in the early victories over Poland and France, when the Luftwaffe had ruled the air with an almost divine certainty, when Messerschmitts carved their names into the sky in Britain trembled beneath the Blitz. But those days were gone, replaced by endless retreat and dwindling resources, by fuel shortages that left planes grounded and training programs cut so thin that boys barely old enough to shave were sent into combat after a dozen hours of flight time. The Allied bombing campaigns had bled Germany's war machine dry, and the once proud Luftwaffe that had struck fear into Europe now struggled to defend its own homeland. The Reich's pilots were no longer hunters. They were defenders, trapped in the skies over a crumbling empire, and yet, even in its decline, the Luftwaffe remained dangerous, its veterans hardened by years of brutal survival, men who flew knowing that each mission might be their last, but who climbed into their cockpits anyway because to them there was nothing else left. Keller had flown reconnaissance for nearly 3 years, his missions taking him from the frozen fronts of Russia to the blood-soaked coastlines of Normandy. And he had seen enough to know that the war was no longer being fought for victory. It was being fought for time. Every photograph he took, every rail line he traced, every factory he recorded from 30,000 feet was a desperate attempt to slow an enemy that could no longer be stopped. On the other side of the Channel, the Royal Air Force had changed too. The Spitfire, once a symbol of defiance during the Battle of Britain, had evolved through countless iterations. New engines, reinforced wings, improved range, each version faster, stronger, more refined than the last, and behind those machines stood a new generation of pilots who had never known the feeling of helpless defense but had grown up with the belief that the air belonged to them. By May 1944, Britain's squadrons were preparing for the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, and the skies over France had become the proving ground. A vast theater of shadow and light, where every encounter carried weight far beyond the men involved. The RAF's mission was clear: sweep the Luftwaffe from the sky, ensure the success of the landings, and dominate every inch of airspace. From the beaches to Berlin, the Germans knew it too, and though their commanders still spoke of counterattacks and secret weapons, the pilots themselves understood that the Reich's dream of air supremacy had died somewhere over the Russian steppe, burned away by attrition, by exhaustion, by the simple truth that they could no longer keep up. The factories at home, once overflowing with the roar of assembly lines, now struggled under bombardment. Fuel was rationed, parts were scarce, and every sortie came at the cost of something irreplaceable. Yet there was still pride, still skill, still fragments of the old fire that had once made the Luftwaffe the most feared force in the world. Men like Keller clung to that fire, not out of loyalty to the Führer or the Reich, but out of devotion to the sky itself, the one place where they felt alive, free from the ruins spreading across the earth below. His observer, Franz Reiter, had joined later when the tide was already turning. A young man with steady hands and a poet's mind who saw the world in shapes and shadows, who could look down from 20,000 feet and find beauty in the destruction. For him, the war was both duty and nightmare. And though he performed his tasks with precision, he sometimes wondered what it all meant, what purpose there was in photographing death from above when it only seemed to multiply. By 1944, Allied aircraft swarmed across Europe in numbers that defied belief. American B-17 seconds and B-24s flying in tight formations like floating cities, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs whose arrival had turned daylight bombing from suicide into certainty, while British Spitfires and Typhoons prowled the low altitudes, striking anything that moved. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin between fronts, could barely mount an effective defense. Its radar network shattered, its pilots exhausted, and still they flew, still they fought. Because somewhere in the smoke and chaos, there lingered a sliver of hope that maybe, somehow, the old order could be restored. On the ground, the German people heard the air battles above and prayed, some for victory, others simply for silence. In the mess halls and hangars, the talk was no longer of triumph but of survival, of how long the fuel would last, of whether reinforcements would ever come, and above it all, in the clear blue expanse of the French morning, Keller's reconnaissance flights traced lonely arcs across the heavens, capturing the end of an era one frame of film at a time. Each mission was a glimpse into a world on the brink, a world where the hunters had become the hunted, where the roar of engines no longer promised conquest but foretold extinction. It was in this crucible of despair and defiance that the legend of May 14th was born, a day that began like any other and ended as a symbol of the Luftwaffe's final reckoning. For months leading up to that morning, Allied patrols had grown bolder, their flights cutting deeper into occupied territory, testing German defenses, mapping their weaknesses, while reconnaissance crews like Keller's became the eyes of a blind giant, reporting on the slow, inevitable encirclement of their own fate. Every report, every film reel sent back to headquarters told the same story. The Allies were everywhere, unstoppable, relentless, and still orders came down to fly again, to watch, to record, to bear witness, because even in its death throes the Reich demanded knowledge, demanded proof of its own demise, and so on that pale May morning, when Keller lifted his aircraft through the mist and saw the horizon split by the silhouettes of fighters, he was not just flying another mission, he was looking directly into the face of history, into the final truth of the war in the air. He did not know it yet. But what he was about to witness would not just be another dogfight. It would be the moment when fear itself changed sides. The Luftwaffe's time was ending, and the men who had once ruled the skies were about to learn what it meant to be prey. This was not the story of heroes or villains, but of men and machines caught in the turning of the tide, their destinies bound to the wind, their courage measured not by victory but by how long they could keep flying as the world beneath them burned. The days leading up to May 14th, 1944, were restless. A strange silence hung over the Luftwaffe bases scattered across northern France. The kind of silence that made veterans nervous because it never lasted long. And beneath that stillness lay the rhythm of preparation, the sound of mechanics hammering rivets, the hiss of fuel lines, the scratch of pencils over maps marked with red and blue arrows that seemed to multiply with every passing week. Oberleutnant Ernst Keller felt the tension in the air before he even stepped onto the tarmac. The way the ground crews moved a little faster, the way radio chatter seemed sharper, more urgent, as if everyone sensed that something vast and irreversible was building just beyond the horizon. Whispers of an Allied invasion had become more than rumor. Every reconnaissance mission confirmed it in fragments. Endless convoys massing in southern England, training flights increasing tenfold, new airfields carved into farmland overnight, and even from 30,000 feet it was clear that the storm was coming, but what no one could predict was how swiftly the balance of power in the skies would shift once that storm broke. For months, the Luftwaffe's intelligence division had struggled to understand the changing patterns of Allied flight formations, the strange new maneuvers observed during patrol intercepts, the increased coordination between bombers and fighters that made once vulnerable targets nearly untouchable. Keller's last few missions had taken him deep over the French coast, photographing bridges, fuel depots, and the growing scars of Allied bombardment. Yet it wasn't the destruction that unsettled him. It was the precision. The British weren't simply attacking. They were dissecting, stripping away layers of defense piece by piece until only the bones remained, and the officers' mess men still spoke with forced bravado about secret weapons. The Me-262 jets that would soon dominate the skies, the V-1 and V-2 rockets that would turn the tide. But those promises sounded hollow now, like a prayer whispered into the wind, and Keller had stopped believing them long ago. The only truth he trusted anymore was the one he saw through his viewfinder. The Allies owned the daylight. Even the night no longer offered refuge, not with radar-controlled mosquitoes hunting the darkness. Every mission had become a test of nerve, every return to base a small miracle. And yet orders continued to come, the Reich demanding eyes over the channel, demanding proof of what every pilot already knew, that invasion was imminent, that the Allied air machine was now too vast to comprehend. The Spitfire, once a familiar adversary, had evolved into something new, something frightening. The latest Mark 9s could climb faster, dive steeper, and turn inside almost anything the Luftwaffe could send against them. And the men who flew them were not the weary defenders of 1940, but confident predators who had learned their craft in the furnace of total war. In the briefing room that morning, Keller sat among half a dozen other pilots, listening as the intelligence officer outlined their task with the detached calm of a man reciting a sentence. A simple reconnaissance flight, northern, France to the coast, altitude 20,000 feet, return by midday. Simple. Except that nothing in the sky was simple anymore. Reiter sat beside him, sketching in his notebook, his expression distant, as though already imagining the world from above. And when Keller glanced over, he noticed a small detail, a line at the bottom of the page, drawn in dark pencil. The sky is thinning. When Keller asked what it meant, Reiter only shrugged and said, "It feels emptier every day," and he wasn't wrong. Fewer German aircraft took to the air with each passing week, their losses unsustainable, their replacements untrained, and though the Reich's propaganda still spoke of glory, the men themselves no longer believed in it. What they believed in now was survival, in getting through one more mission, one more day. The tension was like static electricity, invisible but everywhere, sparking in the smallest of gestures, the tightening of a glove strap, the last drag of a cigarette before stepping to the aircraft, the shared look between men who knew that some of them would not return. Keller performed his pre-flight checks in silence, his hands moving automatically over switches and gauges, the motions of habit replacing thought as the engines roared to life. The sound shook through the metal of the fuselage and into his bones. A reminder that this machine was both his shield and his coffin. Above the airfield, the morning haze was beginning to clear, revealing a sky too bright, too clean for war. It struck him as cruel that beauty could still exist here, that sunlight could fall so gently on a landscape marred by so much pain. As they lifted off, climbing into the pale light, Reiter adjusted the cameras, loaded fresh film, and checked the bearings. Keller kept his eyes on the horizon, where a faint glimmer of silver marked the contrails of other aircraft, too high to identify, but moving with the same confidence that now defined the enemy. The radio crackled with updates from nearby patrols, brief bursts of static and clipped German voices reporting Allied movement, and Keller felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the sense that they were being watched, not by radar, but by something older, primal, as though the sky itself had turned against them. The tension between the two air forces had become more than tactical. It was spiritual, an invisible struggle for dominion over something that once belonged to no one. And in that struggle, Keller could feel the Luftwaffe's spirit waning, crushed beneath the weight of its own legend. The Allies had learned to fight differently, to adapt faster, and that adaptability terrified him more than their numbers. He remembered a briefing weeks earlier when an intelligence officer had described the RAF's new combat doctrine, how they flew in pairs, covering each other's blind spots, how they rotated formations mid-combat to keep pressure constant. And Keller realized then that this was no longer the same war he had trained for. The Luftwaffe's edge had always been its skill, its precision, but now the enemy had both that and something more: purpose. On the eve of the invasion, that purpose burned brighter than ever. For the RAF, every sortie was a step toward liberation. For the Luftwaffe, every mission felt like a funeral flight. Yet men like Keller flew anyway, because they had no choice, because to stop would be to accept defeat outright, and no pilot could bring himself to do that. As the Recon plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Keller scanned the dials and looked down at the patchwork of French countryside sliding by below, so peaceful from above, so deceptive. And he thought of how strange it was that the greatest violence ever waged by mankind could look so quiet from 20,000 feet. Reiter leaned over to check the portside lens, his pencil now resting on his knee, forgotten, and Keller noticed his hand trembling slightly. Though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell, he wanted to say something reassuring, but the words wouldn't come, so instead he said what he always did before a dangerous flight. "We'll make it home by lunch." Reiter smiled faintly and replied, "And what if the Spitfires have other plans?" Keller said nothing. He didn't have to. Both men knew that somewhere up there beyond sight, the enemy was waiting, sharpening its blades in the thin air. As they crossed into Allied patrol range, the sky ahead shimmered with the faint residue of contrails, trails that twisted and dissolved in the wind like ghosts of past battles. The engines hummed, steady, resolute, but Keller couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into something larger than a mission, larger than the war itself, a moment that would define the end of everything they'd once believed about power, fear, and the fragile dominion of men over the heavens. And in that thought, there was both dread and awe. For even in the face of collapse, there was beauty in the way the sky held its secrets until the very last moment before revealing them. ChatGPT said, "E-brochure." The first sign came as a flicker on the horizon, a silver spark against the pale expanse of morning sky that could have been a reflection, a cloud shadow, a trick of light. But Keller knew better, his instincts sharpened by years of flying through the thin air between life and death. And even before Reiter adjusted his binoculars, the veteran pilot could already feel it in his bones, that subtle shift in the atmosphere that told him they were not alone. At 20,000 feet, there was no sound but the steady hum of the engines and the faint creak of metal under strain, yet Keller felt a tension rising, an invisible presence pressing against them from above, and then suddenly, like a curtain being torn away, the sky erupted. Shapes burst from the sun's glare, sleek, agile, impossibly fast, cutting down through the clouds with the precision of blades, and Reiter shouted, "Contact! 12 o'clock high!" Keller rolled the plane slightly to starboard, bringing the figures into view, and his heart clenched as he recognized the unmistakable outline of Spitfires, their wings catching the light like polished steel, diving in perfect synchronization, their trails slicing through the thin white mist that hung over the French countryside. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane was not built for combat, its cameras and instruments replacing the guns that might have saved them. And Keller's first instinct was survival, bank away, drop altitude, find cover in the clouds. But it was already too late. The dogfight had begun far below. A German escort flight of Focke-Wulfs was engaged, their contrails twisting into chaotic spirals as they met the Spitfires head-on, bursts of tracer fire flashing like lightning in the void. Keller leveled out, holding the plane steady while Reiter aimed the camera, capturing the deadly ballet unfolding beneath them. The air was alive with motion, planes weaving and diving in impossible arcs, the sunlight glinting off metal as wings crossed and separated. And though Keller had seen hundreds of battles from above, this one felt different, not a clash of desperation but of dominance. The Spitfires moved with terrifying grace, their attacks coordinated, their defense seamless, and in every maneuver there was confidence, a rhythm that spoke of total control. The Focke-Wulfs fought hard, clawing for position, but their turns were wider, their climbs slower, and one by one the British pilots exploited every weakness with surgical precision. Keller watched through narrowed eyes as one German fighter broke formation, trailing smoke, its pilot trying to roll out of a dive. But a Spitfire was already there, sliding effortlessly behind him, its 303 Browning spitting fire into the fuselage until the German machine disintegrated into flame. Reiter flinched as the wreckage tumbled past their window, the heat shimmer visible even from their altitude. "They're everywhere," he murmured, his voice barely audible through the headset. Keller didn't answer, his mind focused on keeping distance while recording every detail, every angle, because this was more than reconnaissance now. It was witnessing the end of Luftwaffe supremacy. The radio crackled with frantic German voices, call signs overlapping, warnings shouted into static, but Keller could hear the panic beneath the discipline, the disbelief of men who had once ruled the air now being hunted in their own domain. Below them, another German pilot tried to break free, diving sharply toward the countryside, only for two Spitfires to follow, their engines howling as they cut through the dive, like predators closing in on prey, one firing short bursts, forcing the German lower and lower until he crashed into a field that exploded. In a blossom of dirt and smoke, the Recon plane shuddered as the shockwave reached them, and for a moment Keller's hand tightened on the controls. His training told him to withdraw, but something deeper kept him there. An unwilling fascination, a need to see how this played out. "Keep filming," he ordered, and Reiter nodded, his hands shaking as he wound the film. Each frame captured chaos, turned into order. Violence turned into art, and Keller realized that he was watching something far greater than a skirmish. This was the changing of the guard, the precise moment when air power itself shifted from one empire to another. As they turned in a wide arc to stay above the engagement, a shadow suddenly crossed their cockpit. A Spitfire streaking past so close that Keller could see the pilot's face. A flash of goggles, the tilt of a jaw set in calm focus, not hatred, not frenzy, just purpose. It was that expression that haunted Keller most, the look of a man utterly unafraid, Reiter gasped, snapping a still image just as the Spitfire rolled away, its wings glimmering in the light before it vanished into the clouds to rejoin its flight. Keller exhaled slowly, realizing how quiet the sky had become in the seconds after. Until another burst of gunfire shattered the stillness. He looked down again. 3 Spitfires circling a lone German plane that twisted desperately to escape, its wings jerking, its engine trailing smoke, and then a sharp explosion as a burst found its mark. Black debris scattered across the air like confetti, and for a fleeting instant Keller thought he saw a parachute open, drifting down through the smoke before being swallowed by the haze. Reiter crossed himself silently, the camera still whirring, the lens capturing what the human heart could barely process. "Should we help them?" he asked without thinking, and Keller almost laughed, a hollow sound. Because what could they do? They were unarmed, unseen, irrelevant. The war below was not theirs to fight, and yet, as he watched, he felt something twist inside him. A mixture of fear, admiration, and sorrow. He remembered the days when it had been the other way around, when German pilots had descended on British skies with the same ruthless precision, when he had believed the Luftwaffe to be invincible. Now that invincibility was gone, replaced by a cold understanding that the tide had turned forever, one of the Spitfires broke off, climbing rapidly, banking toward the sun before leveling out. And for a terrifying second, Keller thought it was coming for them. His hand hovered over the throttle, ready to dive, but the fighter merely held position, distant yet deliberate. Its silhouette framed by the light, Reiter whispered, "He sees us." And Keller nodded, watching as the Spitfire tilted its wings slightly, a gesture almost like acknowledgement or warning, before turning away, disappearing into the glare. The moment passed, but it left behind a silence more profound than any explosion below. The dogfight dwindled, the last of the German planes falling or fleeing, their contrails cutting downward while the Spitfires rose like hawks reclaiming the air. Keller finally turned the plane toward home, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion and awe. Reiter set the camera aside, his face pale, eyes fixed on the receding battle. "Did you see how they moved?" he said softly, almost to himself. Keller didn't reply. He was thinking of the pilot's calm expression, of the silent acknowledgement between enemies who had never met yet understood each other perfectly. The war in the air was no longer about numbers or machines. It was about mastery, about who commanded the sky's invisible laws, and as they flew back through the thinning clouds, Keller knew that what he had seen would stay with him long after the last contrail faded, because some moments were more than history. They were prophecy, and this one whispered that Germany's dominion had reached its end, written not in words but in the trails of smoke that curled upward into the light, marking the place where power fell and fear took its place. For a long moment after the battle faded into the haze, Keller and Reiter said nothing. Their voices caught somewhere between disbelief and reverence, the silence inside the cabin louder than the engines that carried them home. And as the thin light of morning spread across the horizon, it began to dawn on them that what they had just seen was not merely another fight in the endless ledger of war, but something greater, something symbolic. The moment when a generation of German airmen, once masters of the sky, had been forced to look upward and realize they no longer belonged there. Keller's hands rested on the controls, steady but distant, his mind replaying every movement of the Spitfires, every precise roll and climb that had reduced years of Luftwaffe dominance to ashes in a matter of minutes. And in that repetition he found not anger, not even fear, but a kind of reluctant awe, as though he had witnessed a truth too vast for human pride to comprehend. Reiter broke the silence first, his voice trembling as he said, "They fought like they'd already won, and—" Keller nodded slowly, because that was it exactly. The British pilots had fought not as men desperate to survive, but as men certain of their destiny. They had moved through the air as if guided by the inevitability of victory. And it was that certainty that chilled him more than their guns. For years, the Luftwaffe had been taught that precision and courage could conquer anything, that training and discipline were unbreakable shields. But none of that had mattered in those few terrifying minutes above France. The Spitfires had shattered not just their formation, but the illusion of superiority itself. As the Recon plane crossed back into German-controlled airspace, Keller could feel the weight of that realization settle into the cockpit like an unseen passenger. He thought of the young pilots waiting on the ground, their faces still bright with the old belief in the Reich's invincibility, and wondered how long it would take for the truth to reach them. Reiter adjusted the camera equipment mechanically, but his hands moved slower now, as though burdened by what the lens had captured. "We should have helped them," he muttered, though they both knew that was impossible. And Keller answered quietly, "We did what we were ordered to do." But the words rang hollow, stripped of conviction. The truth was that orders no longer felt like purpose. They felt like denial. Outside, the sky was a perfect blue, deceptively calm, and Keller found himself staring at it, searching for something. Maybe for the shape of that Spitfire that had turned its wings toward them. Maybe for a sign that they had imagined it all. But the sky offered no answers, only emptiness. In that emptiness, he heard echoes of everything he had once believed about war and heroism. And for the first time he wondered whether the Luftwaffe's downfall had begun long before this battle. perhaps the moment they forgot that the sky was not theirs to own, but only to borrow. As they descended toward base, the radio operator on the ground called in for status, his voice crackling through static, but Keller took a long moment before replying, as if reluctant to return to a world that hadn't yet seen what he had seen. When the wheels touched down, the landing gear screeched against the runway, and a plume of dust rose behind them, catching the morning light like smoke from a dying fire. Mechanics rushed forward, saluting, expecting the usual briefing, the usual routine of film canisters and coordinates. But Keller stayed in the cockpit, staring ahead as if frozen. Reiter climbed out first, his legs unsteady, and passed the camera reels to the ground officer, his face pale, eyes distant. When the officer asked how it went, Reiter only said, "We saw the future," and walked away. Keller finally dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with the heaviness of a man who no longer trusted it to hold him. Inside the debriefing room, the air was thick with the smell of fuel and sweat, charts pinned to the walls showing the crumbling lattice of German defenses, arrows sweeping inward from every direction. He handed over the mission log, his handwriting uneven, and when the intelligence officer asked what they'd encountered, Keller hesitated before answering. "Spitfires, more than I've ever seen. They weren't chasing us, they were hunting everything else," and though the officer nodded, scribbling notes, Keller could see in his eyes that he couldn't understand, because this wasn't about numbers or formations, it was about something intangible, something that couldn't be measured in fuel reports or kill ratios. The collapse of faith later, as the sun dipped below the hangars and the base settled into uneasy quiet. Keller walked out alone to the edge of the airfield, the wind tugging at his flight jacket, the faint smell of oil and grass mingling in the air, and he looked up once more at the sky. It seemed bigger now, emptier, as if the Spitfires had taken something with them when they vanished beyond the clouds. A piece of the Luftwaffe's soul. Reiter joined him after a while, holding 2 mugs of coffee, and they stood there in silence, watching contrails fade into darkness. "Do you think they're still up there?" Reiter asked softly, and Keller smiled faintly. Not out of amusement, but resignation. "They're always up there," he said, "even when we can't see them." And as he spoke, he felt something shift inside him. A quiet acceptance that the war had turned, that the age of German skies was over, and that all that remained was endurance. The reports from that mission would circulate through command, dissected, analyzed, and filed away. But among the pilots, it would become something else entirely, a story whispered over cigarettes and ration tins, a reminder that no amount of courage could change the inevitable, and though Keller would fly again, each time he looked toward the horizon he would remember the grace and terror of that morning, the way the Spitfires had danced through the clouds as if they were part of the wind itself. What he had witnessed was not just defeat, it was transformation, the moment when war evolved beyond the reach of fear or pride, when men like him were forced to see themselves not as conquerors, but as remnants of an age that was dying above them. And somewhere deep inside, even as he stood among the ruins of that dying empire, Keller felt a strange peace, because there was something honest in recognizing that truth, something almost human in surrendering to it. What would you have done in this moment? In the days that followed, the film reels from Keller and Reiter's reconnaissance flight were developed under strict supervision, the negatives carried through dim corridors and locked vaults deep within Luftwaffe command. But even before the footage was screened, word had already spread across the airfields of northern France like wildfire. A whisper passed from mechanic to pilot, from mess hall to bunker, that the British Spitfires had carved through a full German escort without loss, that the skies had turned against them. Keller sat in the debriefing room again, the smell of stale tobacco heavy in the air as officers huddled over the flickering projector, their faces pale and silent as the grainy film unfolded. On screen, the Spitfires moved like phantoms, darting through sunlight and cloud, their guns flashing, their movements impossibly fluid, while the Focke-Wulfs crumbled, one by one, their trails spinning downward into smoke. Not a word was spoken, but every man in that room understood what he was watching. The collapse of an empire, frame by frame. When the film ended, the lights came on slowly, revealing faces drained of color, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something worse. "Recognition," one officer muttered. "They've changed. They've learned everything we taught them. And Keller felt a chill run through him, because he knew it was true. The Luftwaffe had once been the teacher of the world, the master of tactics, precision, innovation, but now the student had surpassed the master, and the Germans were left clinging to doctrines that no longer worked in a war that had evolved beyond them. Outside, the airfield roared with the sound of engines preparing for yet another mission, but even that sound felt hollow, like a ritual stripped of meaning. The mechanics worked with mechanical precision. The pilots laughed too loudly, forced bravado covering cracks of doubt that grew wider with each sortie that failed to return. Keller and Reiter walked among them like ghosts, men who had seen what the others only suspected. Reiter carried his camera still, though he hadn't filmed anything since that day, his hands fidgeting. With the shutter as though afraid to use it again. "They won't believe us until it happens to them," he said quietly. And Keller nodded, his eyes tracing a flight of bombers rising into the distance, their silhouettes swallowed by cloud. The war machine continued, indifferent to revelation, but something had changed beneath its surface. A quiet erosion of faith that no speech or victory bulletin could repair. Days turned into weeks, and Allied raids grew bolder, more frequent. The sound of British and American engines filling the night skies over Europe like an approaching storm. Keller flew several more reconnaissance missions, each one heavier than the last, each one haunted by the memory of that Spitfire pilot's calm face. He noticed now that his comrades avoided looking too long at the horizon, as if afraid of what might appear there. One morning, after yet another night of bombings, Keller stood by the hangar doors, watching a squadron of young recruits prepare for their first flight. Boys, really, barely old enough to shave, their eyes bright with the same fire. He'd once carried, their commander barked orders, proud and fierce, but Keller could see the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cap. The older pilots knew the truth. These boys were not flying to glory, but into the maw of inevitability. And then came the mission that broke what little hope remained. It was late May when a full German reconnaissance formation, escorted by veteran fighters, took off at dawn to survey the damage near Calais. They never returned. The radio transmissions were short, panicked, filled with half-shouted coordinates and cut-off screams. Later reports spoke of dozens of Spitfires descending from the clouds like hawks, their attack so precise that not a single German plane escaped. The wreckage was found scattered across the fields and forests of northern France, charred fragments of wings and fuselage marked by the same insignia Keller wore on his sleeve. When he heard the news, he felt something inside him collapse. Not from fear, but from a hollow kind of certainty. There would be no turning this tide, even Reiter, who had once believed. The camera could immortalize victory, stop developing film altogether, saying softly, "There's nothing left to show but the end," and so the base fell silent, not physically, for the engines still roared and orders still came, but spiritually, as though every man there was merely waiting for history to overtake him. Keller often found himself looking to the west, watching contrails drift toward the sea, knowing that somewhere beyond that horizon the Allies were gathering strength beyond imagination. And at night, when he lay awake listening to the distant rumble of bombs, he thought again of the Spitfire pilot's calm eyes, of the faint tilt of his wings, a gesture that now felt less like a warning and more like a farewell. Reiter once asked him what he thought would happen when the war ended, and Keller answered without hesitation, "The sky will belong to whoever fears it least," and in that moment he understood that fear had already chosen its side. As summer approached, the Allied invasion loomed on the horizon, though few in the Luftwaffe yet dared to speak. But Keller could feel it coming, as surely as a storm breaking over the Channel, and he knew that, when it arrived, the skies above Europe would burn brighter and louder than ever before. And in that blaze, the Luftwaffe's legacy would be consumed completely, leaving only men like him to remember what it had once felt like to rule the air. Can you imagine witnessing that? ChatGPT said, Seb, when the invasion finally came, it came not as a single roar, but as 1,000 engines. 1,000 shadows cast across the dawn. June 6, 1944, D-Day. And Keller stood at the edge of the airfield, watching the sky fill with the silhouettes of Allied aircraft moving in endless formation, a black tide stretching from horizon to horizon. There was no pattern he could recognize, no gaps, no weakness. Just the overwhelming presence of power. He had seen air superiority before, but never this, never domination so complete that it made the heavens themselves seem smaller. The German command scrambled what squadrons remained, calling up veterans and boys alike, men who barely knew their own aircraft, their faces pale beneath helmets that no longer fit the myth of invincibility. Keller didn't fly that morning. His reconnaissance orders had been suspended. But he stood beside Reiter and watched the Luftwaffe's last effort unfold. One by one, the fighters took off, engines screaming, wheels kicking up dirt and smoke, and Keller knew as each disappeared into the rising sun that most of them would not return. Within hours, the air above Normandy became a storm of fire and sound, Spitfires and Mustangs weaving through the chaos, intercepting, strafing, destroying. Reiter's old camera, once a tool of documentation, now felt like a relic, a useless witness to the death of an era. He lifted it anyway, snapping photos that no one would ever develop, as if to prove that they had still existed, that the Luftwaffe had still been there. Even at the end, reports came in by noon. Dozens of German planes downed in minutes, entire squadrons erased before they could climb above the clouds. Keller stood in the command hut, listening to the radio chatter disintegrate into static and silence. Every transmission ended the same way, with a burst of noise, then nothing. One officer slammed his fist against the table, shouting that it was impossible, that no Air Force could be so absolute. But the truth was written in the smoke that drifted across the horizon. Reiter lowered the camera and said softly, "They own the sky now, and no one." Answered by evening, the survivors began to return. Those few who had managed to limp home in crippled aircraft, their faces hollow, their eyes unfocused. They spoke of swarms of Spitfires, of typhoons screaming down from the clouds, of tracers so dense it felt like flying through rain. Keller walked among them, offering water, offering silence, because there was nothing else to give. One young pilot, his uniform still smoking, grabbed his sleeve and whispered, "We didn't stand a chance. They were everywhere, like ghosts, before collapsing into the dirt. By nightfall, the base was half destroyed, the runways cratered, hangars burning, the officers ordered a withdrawal inland. But even as they packed, Allied bombers began their raids, and Keller found himself running for cover as explosions tore through what was once his world. When dawn rose again, the base was gone, reduced to twisted metal and silence. In that silence, Keller felt something strange, a lightness, a kind of release, as though the weight of years had finally lifted, leaving only truth in its place. Reiter found him sitting by the wreck of their reconnaissance plane, staring at the sky that had betrayed them, or perhaps one they had betrayed by believing it could be conquered. "It's over," Reiter said quietly, and Keller nodded. Not in despair, but in understanding. He thought of the Spitfires again, of that battle weeks before, realizing now that it had been an omen, a glimpse of what the future would look like. Machines faster, men braver, wars fought with precision and will beyond imagination. The Luftwaffe's dream of dominance had ended, not in disgrace, but in transformation. The world had changed, and they had been too proud to change with it. Keller stood and looked to the west, where the contrails of Allied bombers stretched endlessly toward France, marking the path of history itself. The war would grind on for another year, but for men like him, it had already ended on that morning in May, when they first saw the Spitfires cut through the sky like light through glass. Now, as he turned away from the ruins, he understood that his duty was no longer to fight but to remember, to bear witness to what it felt like when the heavens themselves declared allegiance. And somewhere deep in his chest, he felt both grief and gratitude, the grief of loss and the gratitude of having lived long enough to see truth revealed without words, without glory, only the final honesty of defeat. In that moment, Keller finally made peace with the sky. Years later, long after the gunfire had fallen silent and the flags had changed, Keller would find himself standing on a quiet airstrip somewhere in the ruins of Germany, the war reduced to echoes and photographs, the sound of engines replaced by the hum of wind through broken hangars, and he would look up to a sky that no longer belonged to anyone. It was late autumn, 1949, and the world had moved on, the nations rebuilding what they could, the memory of the war slowly softening in the public imagination. But not for him, not for Reiter, and not for the men who had lived in the shadow of wings. Keller still carried the weight of that morning in May 1944, when he and Reiter had flown above France and seen the Spitfires dance through sunlight and smoke, when for the first time fear had not come from the enemy's guns but from the realization that their own era had ended. He thought often about the pilot who had tilted his wings, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning, a salute or a warning or perhaps both, and as the years passed, Keller came to understand that. It had not been directed at him alone, but at everything he represented. The pride, the certainty, the illusion that control could be eternal now, standing beneath a sky that had seen too much. Keller realized that the true legacy of that moment was not defeat, but humility, the knowledge that no nation, no air force, no man could ever truly own the air. Reiter had not survived the final months of the war. His reconnaissance plane was shot down over the Rhine in 1945, but Keller had heard that the film reels they made on May 14th had been found in a vault by Allied troops, the images preserved, the story retold by historians who could never quite believe the footage was real. They called it "The Day the Luftwaffe Blinked," a poetic way of describing what had really been a revelation. Keller never saw the film again, but sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still see it frame by frame. The flashes of sunlight on Spitfire wings, the spirals of smoke tracing the fall of Focke-Wulfs, the serene, terrifying precision of flight that bordered on artistry. Those images had marked him more deeply than any battle could have, because they showed him not just the end of his cause, but the beginning of something larger, the age of the sky as a shared domain, no longer a weapon of nations, but a frontier of humanity. In the years that followed, he watched the world's air forces evolve, jets replacing propellers, rockets replacing courage, and he wondered whether those new pilots understood what the sky demanded of them. Courage, yes, but also respect, and perhaps even fear. Fear not of the enemy, but of the endlessness above them, of the reminder that to fly is to challenge nature itself. Keller became a teacher eventually, quietly instructing young aviators who were too young to remember the war. And sometimes when they asked him what it had been like to face the Spitfires, he would pause before answering, searching for words that could carry the weight of that moment. "They made the sky look alive," he would say softly, and the students would nod, not really understanding, yet somewhere in those words the truth remained that flight, at its core, was not about dominance, but about surrender, about learning to move with the wind instead of against it. He would never tell them about the fear he'd felt or the admiration that had followed, nor about the strange peace that had come with losing something you once believed you owned. Those things he knew belonged to another time, and yet as he grew older, Keller began to find comfort in the idea that history had chosen that moment, May 14th, 1944, as a kind of pivot, a day when the sky itself seemed to decide its own fate. Nations rose and fell, machines changed, tactics evolved, but the essence of flight remained the same, a fragile, fleeting defiance of gravity and time. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would walk out to the field near his home and watch the contrails of modern jets high above, white threads weaving across the blue, and he would smile faintly because he could still recognize the same patterns, the same grace, the same whisper of what he had once seen in the Spitfires. And though the world had moved on, Keller understood. Now that legacy was not about victory, but memory, and that in remembering, even defeat could become a kind of triumph. The world would tell its stories in books and documentaries, the names of battles carved into marble, but few would ever know the quiet truth of those who lived between the lines. Men like him, who had looked upon the future and felt both terror and awe. If you had asked Keller in his final years what he thought when he looked back on that day, he might have said this: that he had seen beauty born out of destruction, that he had witnessed mastery so pure it transcended war itself, and that he had understood, finally, that the sky belonged to no one, not to empires or flags or ideologies, but to those who dared to look up and see it as it was, vast, impartial, eternal. And perhaps that was the true lesson of that morning. the message written not in words but in vapor trails fading against the light, that the sky forgives nothing but remembers everything. And as the years passed and Keller's memory began to dim, one vision remained sharp. The Spitfire turning in sunlight, its wings flashing once before disappearing into cloud, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any victory speech ever could. The sky, after all, had no loyalty, only truth, and so history would record May 14th, 1944, as a day of loss for one side and triumph for another. But Keller would always remember it differently, not as defeat but as awakening, the moment when he finally saw what flight truly meant. And to those who still wonder what it must have felt like to stand beneath that sky, to watch the world change in a single heartbeat, to feel the cold thrill of fear and admiration all at once, do you think history could have gone differently?